Hey everybody, Mr. Grove here. Today we're going to start our journey through the animal kingdom, and we're going to start with the phylum Porifera. So these are the sponges. Sponges are going to be the simplest of the animals that we talk about. In fact, they're so simple that really until kind of the late 1700s we thought that they were plants. But we now know that they are animals, and there's about 9,000-ish species, anywhere from 1 centimeter to about 2 meters in size. Some of the key features of sponges is they have an asymmetrical body. So that means they do not have a body plan, and they're not bilateral, and they're not radial. And then also, their cells do not really work together to form tissues or organs. And so that is going to be some kind of key features as to how sponges can then interact with their environment. Some other things on sponges is they have these things called ostela and oscula. So the ostela are these tiny pores on the outside of the sponge, and that's where water is going to go in to the sponge. And then the oscula is going to be this larger pore or hole, and that's usually in the center of the sponge, and water will leave then the sponge. And so what enables the water to move is going to be this. So the key cell feature for sponge is going to be the chanocytes. These are sometimes called collar cells, and so that would be these guys here. And so they line the interior of the sponge, and they've got this little sticky collar around them, which is where we get that collar cell name. And then they have a flagella, and so the flagella will beat back and forth and create a current for that water to go in through the ostela and then out through the oscula. And so the idea is to trap food particles there that can be digested intracellularly, and that's kind of a key feature. So since we're intracellular, that means it's going to be carried or eaten inside the sponge cell. That means if your food fits inside your cell, you have to have really small food. So therefore, sponges have to filter out these teeny tiny little particles that are kind of going through the water. Sadly, not a Krabby Patty, as our friend SpongeBob would have us believe. Another cell is called amoebocytes, and amoebocytes are specialized cells that help transfer nutrients throughout this mesophyll to the rest of the cells. Okay, so those are kind of two feature cells, chanocytes and amoebocytes. Typically, we would call sponges sessile, meaning that they're not going to move around. So once they find a spot, that's where they will stay the rest of their lives. Some other things about sponge. So we see our sponge structure in just kind of a different diagram here. So these would be the chanocytes, and then these would be the amoebocytes that would help move those nutrients and waste then throughout the sponge. And so the chanocyte, closer look, there's the flagella, and then there's the sticky collar that would catch the food. As far as sponge diversity goes, it kind of depends on how the skeleton is put together. So we have these particles called spicules and spongin. So spicules are kind of more carbonate or silica, needle-based, and so the sponge is going to be a little bit harder. Whereas spongin is more of a protein fiber, and it's going to allow for a little bit more flexibility of the sponge. And so depending on if you are more of a spicule sponge or if you're a spongin sponge or if you have some of both, will kind of determine what kind of classification we put you in for your sponge categories. Reproduction-wise, sponges are simple enough that they can asexually reproduce very well through fragmentation, so like just a small piece will break off. Through budding, where we have a small sponge piece that will grow off of the side. And then they also have these little gymnules. So gymnules are going to just kind of be clusters of amoebocytes that will just kind of move off and swim off to a new location. But those would all be asexual, so the offspring would be genetically cloned of the parent. Sexual reproduction, so the sperm will swim from one sponge through the ostela, and then into the sponge where the eggs would be on the other sponge. And so that would be a sexual reproduction, to where then after fertilization, the zygotes would grow into a larva. The larva would then find a new spot to swim around and attach. And so that is kind of the sponge diversity. So that is sponges. And that's the phylum Porifera. So they've got holes all over their bodies, and that's where that comes from. Pores, porifera. And I hope that was helpful.